Look what we have here, boys. Another diversity hire sent to lower the standards. The voice drenched in the kind of casual arrogance that only a big fish in a very small pond can muster, cut through the low hum of the training facility. The crowd of cadets, a sea of gray sweats and nervous energy, rippled with sycophantic laughter. They turned to see Cadet Sergeant Dylan Cross, his chest puffed out like a pouter pigeon, standing with his two shadows, Barrett and Chun. His target was the new arrival, a woman standing by the edge of the sparring mats, methodically taping her hands. She was of average height, with a wiry frame that seemed almost lost in the standard issue fatigues. Her hair was pulled back in a severe functional bun, and her face was a mask of placid neutrality. She did not look up. She did not flinch. She simply continued her task, pulling the white athletic tape taut with a practiced rhythmic efficiency from a shadowed observation deck overlooking the cavernous hall known as the Forge. General Morrison watched, his eyes narrowed, not at Cross's predictable peacocking, but at the woman's hands. He saw the faint silvery tracery of old scars across her knuckles, and the almost imperceptible way her stance distributed her weight. A perfect economy of balance that screamed of thousands of hours of instinctual practice. The general leaned forward slightly, a flicker of profound curiosity cutting through his customary weariness. Down on the floor, Cross was just getting warmed up, his voice echoing with theatrical disdain. "Seriously, what is your name, sweetheart? Did you get lost on your way to the admin building? This is where the actual warriors train. We cannot have you breaking a nail." More laughter, louder this time. Emboldened by the target's utter lack of reaction, her silence was a vacuum, and Cross, like all insecure men, felt an overwhelming need to fill it with noise. He stepped closer, crowding her personal space, a classic intimidation tactic that had served him well in the rigidly hierarchical world of the academy. He was the top of his class, a physical specimen built by the book, and he saw in her everything he had been taught to despise, a perceived weakness, an exception to the rule, a threat to the purity of his meritocratic ideal. But when the general saw her stance, the subtle shift of her hips as Cross approached, a motion not of retreat, but a preparation, he knew. This was not an exception to the rule. This was a rule the cadets had never even learned existed. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the voice, but in the quietness of the hands-type competence below the woman officer candidate, Rivera finished wrapping her left hand. Each fold of tape was perfect, each press firm and deliberate. Her focus was absolute, a bubble of professional calm in a room crackling with juvenile hostility. Cross, interpreting her silence as fear, as submission, turned to his audience, playing to the gallery. "Watch this, everyone. This is what happens when politics trumps merit. This is what weakness looks like when you give it a uniform." He gestured dismissively at Rivera, his hands sweeping in a theatrical arc. Barrett and Chun flanked him now, forming a loose semicircle of menace. The crowd of cadets, eager for the spectacle, pressed closer, their phones out, ready to capture the humiliation. This was entertainment, a blood sport dressed in the veneer of patriotic gatekeeping. Master Sergeant Kane, the grizzled instructor overseeing the session, stood by the equipment racks with his arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. He made no move to intervene, a silent endorsement of the hierarchy being enforced. Rivera finally looked up, not at Cross, but through him, her gaze settling somewhere in the middle distance. Her expression remained utterly neutral, devoid of anger, fear, or even acknowledgement. It was the look of someone performing mental calculations, assessing vectors and angles with the same detached professionalism a surgeon might bring to an operating table. Cross mistook this for vacancy, for shock. He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers now, his breath hot and invasive. "Come on, sweetheart," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant only for her, but loud enough for the front row to hear. "Just admit you do not belong here. Save yourself the embarrassment. Go back to whatever diversity seminar sent you, and let the real soldiers do their job." From the observation deck, General Morrison's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He had seen this dance before, the predator circling what he assumed was prey. But he had also seen the micro-adjustments in Rivera's posture, the way her center of gravity had dropped by perhaps an inch, the subtle repositioning of her feet into a stance that was deceptively casual yet operationally perfect. What happened next occurred in the space between heartbeats, in that quantum moment where potential energy transforms into kinetic reality. Cross, emboldened by her continued silence, reached out. His hand, large and calloused, moved to grab her shoulder, to physically turn her away in a final gesture of dominance. It was the miscalculation that would define the next 3 seconds of his life. Rivera moved, not with the explosive aggression of a street brawler, not with the wild flailing of desperation, but with the surgical precision of a master craftsman executing a technique practiced 10,000 times until it became as natural as breathing. Her right hand intercepted his reaching arm at the wrist, her fingers wrapping around it with a grip that was firm but not crushing, controlling but not telegraphing intent. Simultaneously, her left hand rose in a smooth arc, redirecting the momentum of his grab with an inside parry that was textbook defensive doctrine. Cross felt the shift immediately, the sudden loss of control, but his brain had not yet caught up to the reality of what was happening. In a single, unbroken sequence of motion, she secured a grip on his wrist, stepped across his body, and dropped her center of gravity. It was a hip throw, so perfectly executed, so utterly flawless that Cross was airborne before his brain could even process what was happening. For a brief, suspended moment, he was weightless, his entire body subject to the inexorable laws of leverage she had imposed upon him. He hit the mat with a deep, resonant thud that silenced the very air in the room. Before he could even gasp for breath, she was on him, her knee pinning his shoulder, her hands transitioning his arm into a lock that threatened to tear his elbow apart with the slightest application of pressure. It was over. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, Rivera had not thrown a single punch. She had not uttered a single sound. She had simply disassembled him. The aftermath was a silence more profound and deafening than any explosion. The cadets stood frozen, their mouths agape, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed. Cross lay pinned, his face a mask of shattered arrogance and dawning horror, his chest heaving. He could only manage a choked, incredulous whisper that was audible to everyone in the tomb-like quiet. That is not possible. Rivera held the lock for 1 more second, ensuring the lesson was complete, then released his arm and rose to her feet in a single fluid motion. She stepped back into a posture of quiet neutrality, her work apparently concluded. Her breathing remained calm and even, as if she had done nothing more strenuous than fold laundry. Cross remained on the mat, clutching his shoulder, his face flushed with humiliation and pain. Barrett and Shun had taken several unconscious steps backward, their own aggressive postures completely deflated. The crowd of cadets stood in shock paralysis, their phones still recording, but their expressions transformed from anticipation of entertainment to witnessing something they could not comprehend. The pecking order they had understood, the hierarchy they had internalized, had just been obliterated in 3 seconds by someone they had dismissed as irrelevant. The spell of shocked silence was broken by the sound of measured footsteps on the steel staircase descending from the observation deck. Every head turned. General Morrison moved with an unhurried authority that commanded the room more effectively than any shouted order. The cadets, jolted from their stupor, snapped to a rigid, if somewhat shaky, posture of attention. Master Sergeant Kane's face was a stony mask, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of deep surprise as the base commander strode onto the training floor. Morrison ignored the instructor. He ignored the rows of petrified cadets, and he walked past the prone and defeated form of Dylan Cross as if he were a piece of discarded equipment. His focus was entirely on Rivera, who had already released Cross's arm and risen to her feet, stepping back into a posture of quiet neutrality. Her work apparently concluded. The general stopped a few feet from her, his gaze intense and analytical. The entire population of the forge held its breath. Morrison did not ask about the fight. He did not comment on the result. He made a statement, his voice calm and resonant. The initial parry was textbook Krav Maga. A simple inside redirection, but the takedown, the fluid transition from the wrist lock to the hip throw. That was pure systema. You do not learn that combination in any American military doctrine. Who was your instructor? For the first time, Rivera spoke in a full sentence, her voice clear and even devoid of any discernible emotion. Master Chief Petty Officer Rivera, sir, my father. A wave of confusion washed over the cadets. Rivera liked Dylan Cross. General Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly, processing this information with the speed of a career military strategist. He nodded once, a gesture that conveyed both understanding and respect. Your father trained SEAL team operators in close-quarters combat for over 2 decades. He developed integration protocols that are still classified. The general paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled cadets before returning to Rivera. You were taught by one of the finest hand-to-hand combat instructors in the history of special operations. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. The cadets who had laughed moments before now stood in mortified silence, their faces pale with the realization of what they had witnessed and participated in. They had mocked someone whose training exceeded anything they would encounter in their entire academy careers. They had called weak someone whose father had trained the most elite warriors in the American military. Barrett and Chin looked at each other, then down at their feet, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Cross, still on the mat, closed his eyes as if he could will himself into non-existence. Master Sergeant Kane finally moved, stepping forward with a newfound caution. Sir, I was unaware of Officer Candidate Rivera's background. The file only indicated standard entry qualifications. General Morrison turned his gaze to Kane, and the instructor visibly stiffened under the weight of it. That is precisely the point, Sergeant. True competence does not announce itself. It does not need to. The general turned back to Rivera, his expression softening slightly. Officer Candidate Rivera, you will report to my office at 1600 hours. We need to discuss your training integration and how best to utilize your skill set within the program structure. Rivera came to attention, her posture perfect. Yes, sir. General Morrison then turned to address the entire room, his voice carrying the weight of command that had led men through decades of military operations. Let this be a lesson to everyone here. The military does not operate on assumptions. It operates on capability. You do not judge a soldier by appearance, by gender, by your preconceived notions of who belongs and who does not. You judge them by their actions, by their skills, by what they can do when it matters. He let the silence stretch, ensuring every word landed with full impact. Cadet Sergeant Cross, you will report to medical for evaluation, then to my office at 1700 hours. We will discuss leadership, respect, and whether you possess the judgment required to wear those stripes. Cross managed a hoarse response from the mat. Yes, sir. Morrison nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the staircase. As the general's footsteps echoed up the steel stairs, the forge remained in stunned silence. Rivera calmly finished adjusting her hand wraps, her demeanor unchanged from when she had first entered the facility. The crowd of cadets began to disperse slowly, their earlier hostility replaced by wary respect and a profound sense of having witnessed something that would fundamentally alter the social dynamics of the academy. Barrett helped Cross to his feet, the bully moving gingerly, his shoulder clearly paining him. As they passed Rivera on their way to medical, Cross paused. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. What could he say? An apology would be inadequate. A threat would be absurd. He simply nodded once, a bare acknowledgement of defeat and perhaps the beginning of understanding, then continued on with his head lowered. Master Sergeant Kane approached Rivera cautiously. Officer Candidate, when you are ready, I would like to discuss incorporating some of your training methodology into our advanced combat curriculum. Rivera looked at him with those same calm, assessing eyes. Of course, Sergeant. I am here to serve. The hierarchy had been reset. True competence had spoken.